always run out of good infantrymen. And in a volunteer military, the force you begin with will always be better than the force you end with. So however we go to war, after 9/11, we were a military going down to 8 divisions. Can you imagine fighting 10 years of war with 8 divisions? And the price we've paid in the last 10 years. And Husch is right, very few soldiers have been killed, 99%. But 460,000 have been emotionally and mentally damaged because of repetitive tour after tour after tour. Why? Because we ran out of close combat forces. So the bottom line is, unlike today, armies only prosper when they bleed. MRAPs, body armor, anti-IED protection, all of those things came out after soldiers began to die. And I see no difference as we look into the future. Someone can tell me how that will change. And what's so interesting about this is the national security the national security machine inside the Beltway, as Husch said, 100% of the time gets it wrong. And we do silly things, like, for instance, Krepinevich's famous 5 scenarios. We have never called this, ever. Harry Truman didn't know where Korea was on the 25th of June, 1950. You think Lyndon Johnson had in a scenario 58,000 dead? George Bush had no clue that Saddam Hussein was going to rush into Kuwait. And I could go on and on and on. Who predicted 9/11? One guy predicted 9/11 that I know of in this, and his voice, of course, was drowned out. So the idea that somehow we can anticipate who our enemies are going to be and build forces against a specific enemy is absolutely wrong. Now, there's an old saying, and I'll end with this and close with my good friend, the fighter pilot here. There's an old saying that bad generals try to fight the next war like the last. Absolutely not. Good generals try to fight the next war like the last, and bad ones try to invent war. You can go back over the last 70 years, and while our enemies have changed, the levels of war that we've fought have shifted from pre-insurgency all the way up to something approaching general war in Korea and the march to Baghdad and the Great Wheel. And the tenets that drive that conflict have not changed in 70 years. It's the only constant that should drive our national security strategy, and it goes like this, and Husch alluded to it. First of all, we don't own the strategic initiative in the world, and we haven't for 70 years. The enemy does. We react to the actions of the enemy rather than forcing the enemy to react to us. And the enemy's strategy, whether it's from Lin Piao to Osama bin Laden, has been exactly the same and completely rational with their worldview. And I'll just run it by you very quickly. The object in the war is not to win, but to avoid losing. You achieve your strategic aims by guarding your rural hegemony, by keeping Americans away. If they intrude, then you protract the war and you kill as many of them as you can until you affect their strategic center of gravity, which is American public opinion, and they pack up and they go home. You beat the Americans, as Husch alluded, not by developing missiles and rockets and satellites and cyber warfare. You do it by killing them with conventional legacy weapons used in a new and imaginative way. What's the greatest killer of Americans in the American era of war? Anybody want to offer an idea? Greatest things, most killed, anybody, you probably heard this pitch before, so I'm screwed. It's the mortar. A mortar costs about $2.50, and it's fired from a cast iron tube, or from a wrought iron tube, if it's of Soviet manufacture. And that same weapon has killed more Americans in every war we've ever fought since the end of World War II. So, there's a great quote from Ho Chi Minh, when a French journalist in 1964 asked him, how in the world do you ever expect to beat the world's greatest superpower? And he replied prophetically, they will kill many of us. We will kill a few of them, and they will tire of it first. And that's driven the strategy, like it or not, for the last 70 years. Now I'm going to agree with Husch. It's painful. Who is the enemy going to be? I don't know. And that huge sausage manufacturing machine inside the Beltway collectively don't have a clue either. But I think we know enough to say, to his point exactly, it's all about geopolitics and latitude. Increasingly, the world is becoming one of have and have-nots, and it's created a global point of intersection where the have-nots are seeking to take back what the haves have, bad choice of words. And that runs the gamut from narco-terrorists and gangs all the way up through stateless actors to terrorist states to state-supported terrorists. And I believe as we move into the future, in fact, the generals who try to fight the last war probably will be more right than the generals who try to fight the next war, a war that we simply won't have. So, we're going to war not based on how it starts. We're going to war based on how it ends. And we're going to go to war against an enemy equipped with what he has rather than what we wish he had. And we're going to fight an enemy whose strategic intent is to defeat us asymmetrically and not directly. And that enemy is not going to be China. Mike?
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Tower Center. I'm from Washington, and I'm here to help you. I'm going to cover the subject in the way Washington covers it, which is in the inverted order. And I'm going to talk about budgets first, and then forces and then strategy. In Washington, most experts think the defense budget has to decrease to help pay down the deficit. And if you look at Bowles-Simpson and other proposals, we're going to cut half from defense and half from other discretionary accounts. But there's a number of problems with this, and this pitch will be, I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, so I apologize in advance. But defense has already been cut $500 billion over 10 years, while the other accounts have increased by $1 trillion per year. So you've already got a skewed baseline. In addition, defense, we've come out of Iraq, we're coming out of Afghanistan. That's going to save another $100 billion a year. So defense baseline is down, and the other accounts are up, and we're going to take equally from the two. Second problem. The third problem is defense is costing us about $525 billion a year, the base budget. We could take that to zero, and we will still have a deficit of $600 to $700 billion per year. I look out at the international environment. These two gentlemen, I've explained it pretty well. Bob talked about 3 fighter pilots and scales. It's to equal out the IQ of the table. So on this side, we're all equal. But the international environment is more complex than ever. We have terrorists. 6 years ago, former Secretary of Defense William Perry said that he believes there's a 90% chance, 90% chance of a nuclear weapon going off on U.S. soil. And I'm not inventing this. I'm just reporting what somebody else said. We have terrorists with W&D. We have smart mortars like the ones that hit Benghazi. Can you imagine something that fits in a panel truck that can really hit what it aims at and it's good within 5 kilometers? You could pull it up next to National Airport in Washington, D.C., it can hit the White House accurately without detection. North Korea hasn't gone away. Iran is still looming. Russia and China are building up their forces. China flew its 3rd stealth fighter, 5th-generation fighter in development most recently. They're going to sell their equipment abroad. We have cyber attacks daily. And I would even argue the high ground of space is a little bit at risk, given some of the tests the Chinese and others have done. Air and naval defenses are improving around the world. And the one thing we do know, as has already been pointed out, is that we've always guessed wrong on where we're going to have to fight next. I believe that both the Navy and the Air Force are at a crossroads. I'll let Admiral Walsh talk about the Navy. I know the Air Force better. If you happen to have caught the Wall Street Journal last Wednesday, I have a piece that's been published in the op-ed section that will lay out the case on an Air Force that's its flight to weakness. Of course, nobody read it because it was the day after the election, and they were either celebrating or in mourning. I don't know which. The Air Force is the smallest in history. The last time they had this number of few people was June of 1940. It's also the smallest in the number of airplanes. In the last 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, we've had what I call a stealth drawdown. We are net 700 airplanes smaller than the Air Force was in 2008. So I think that's more fighters than the Navy even owns. It's also, and the administration wanted to retire another 300 aircraft. So we were going to be down about 900 or so aircraft in size. It is also the oldest in history, 25 years average. There are some airplanes that are 50 years old. 50 years old. I quipped once to a Texas Aggie who happened to be Chief of Staff, Buzz Mosley, and that the last KC-135 pilot has not yet been born. And he said back to me, he says, hell, the mother of the last KC-135 pilot hasn't been born. He was not exactly accurate, but I'm here to report today the mother of the last KC-135 pilot is in 4th grade. So if that makes any difference to you. Replacements have been very slow in coming. The Department of Defense requested 54 airplanes this year. Now, since the Air Force has about 5,200 at the rate of 54 airplanes per year, you're looking at a 100-year replacement rate. 100-year replacement rate. And while that's faulty math, as Dr. Chu will point out later, in a sense, it's gone from a 70-year replacement rate to an 80-year replacement rate to a 90-year to now 100-year. So it's going in the exact wrong direction. The aerospace industry, as you all well know, counts for about 10 million jobs and $50 billion in net positive exports around the world. Over the last 4 years, it's lost thousands and thousands of jobs. If sequestration occurs, a study by George Mason University indicates another 2.13 million jobs, direct and indirect jobs, will be lost. In the 2020s for the Air Force, and I'll just touch on this, if you look at it, the Air Force will be buying the long-range bomber, a tanker, and the F-35. They're facing a square corner. The T-38 is already 50 years old. You've got helicopters that need to be replaced. We're going to be buying C-130Js. All the Boeing 707 airframes, J-Stars, AWACS, WC, EC, RC-135s, have to be replaced with something, or the mission's jettisoned. You've got a C-17, oldest C-17 is 22 years old. They were designed for a 30-year lifespan, and 750 hours a year, they're flying over 1,200 hours per year today. Minuteman III, we've got to figure out what to do with their ICBMs. And then there's space and cyberspace. So what's the answer? There are no clear and easy ones to look at. I would argue that we are going to make some mistakes. In the mid-1930s, the Army had a competition for the next bomber. It competed the B-17 against the B-18. And the B-18 was cheaper and lighter, and you could buy more of them, and it won the competition. Of course, it didn't help that the first flight of the B-17, the pilot left the parking brake on and crashed on takeoff and burned in the B-17. But the Army chose the B-18. Look at World War II and the contributions of the B-18. Very difficult to find. Yet this country made 12,000 B-17s. And what happened was the Congress, in its wisdom, added money to the Army budget to buy 13 B-17s that saved Boeing Aircraft Corporation from going out of business. So we need to be careful that we don't make mistakes in procuring the wrong equipment. I argued that defense is job one. And if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Now, I would submit to you in Washington, we're seeing the two verbs changed. We're seeing provide for the general welfare, promote the common defense. And that's what I see most often. Consider this, in World War II, 36% of our economy was going toward defense. In Korea, the number was 12%. In Vietnam, 9%. 6% during the Reagan buildup. Today, the number is 3.4% if you include wartime spending, and it's scheduled to go down to 2.7% of GDP, defense spending. Trying to figure out a way to contrast that, and I haven't done this publicly, so bear with me, with other choices that the nation has to make. And I stumbled across a report from the Heritage Foundation that has looked at welfare. Now, I'm not against welfare, so I'll share that with you up front, but we spend as a nation 50% more on welfare than we do on defense. And if you add in what the states spend, it's about $1 trillion per year. We spend $75 billion a year on food stamps, which is almost double the Department of Homeland Security's budget. $75 billion versus Homeland Security's budget. The 10 largest welfare programs, and there's about 79 of them, cost the nation, are expected to grow to $8.3 trillion over the next decade. So a couple things to take from this welfare example is that when we started the war on poverty in 1964, some 60 years ago, we failed. The war on poverty has literally failed. And to give you a stat from congressional testimony in May, if you add up all the money we spent on welfare and the war on poverty, it amounts to about $20 trillion. If you look at the cost of all American wars, from the Revolutionary War to Afghanistan, it's about $7 trillion. Now, these are in 2011 dollars. So we have spent 3 times as much on welfare as we spent on all the wars we've fought. I would argue also that our poor are and this is not, doesn't mean much, they're in better shape than the middle classes of many countries. I mean, 80% have air conditioning, on and on, you know, access. 1/3 have big screen TVs, et cetera. So we're going to have to make a choice as a nation going forward. Now to the strategy. So I've covered forces, budget and forces, quick strategy. The simple strategy that we have, and it hasn't changed for many, many years, is that we don't want to fight a war. We want to deter warfare. The Reagan quote that I use all the time is, "No war in my lifetime has come about because America was too strong." If we do have to fight a war, it ought to be a war of last resort, but it also ought to be a war fought in the other guy's territory. We don't want to fight it here on our own shores. I would argue that we also want to have a minimum loss of life. We don't want a long war, a war of attrition. We don't want to project vulnerability going forward. I believe we should remember all this when we set our budget priorities. I am optimistic about the future, and while Bob quoted Ho Chi Minh, I'll leave the stage with quoting Winston Churchill. You can always count on America to do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
Thank you, Mike. That's terrific. Thank you. A couple of quick points. One of my favorite stories of Air Force useful duplicity was his story of the B-17. Mike, do you know why the Congress bought those 13 B-17s? What their mission was? Those 13 B-17s?
Reconnaissance.
Huh?
Reconnaissance.
No, it was coastal defense. And the boys at the Air Tactical School had it all figured out that we were going to bomb the bejesus out of Germany and Japan, but we bought it for Also, another interesting, useless point if you're a historian, talk about the age of aircraft. What is the oldest large-scale weapon system in the American inventory today? Anybody want to hazard a guess? And when was it built?
Yeah, the rifle.
Huh? The old, yeah.
Is it,
Nope.
is it you?
Me. No, it's the M2 machine gun, the largest, most heavily used weapon probably in the American arsenal, and it was designed and built in 1919. So, Pat, you're on the stage.
Well, Bob, I think you're right. Whatever you said, I agree with it. I think it'd be, I'd like to take advantage of having recent experience in the region that Bob is less concerned about than I am, to just sort of play out some of the events that have taken place in a very short period of time. And at the top of the list is going to be issues related to the environment. We went through 6 humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations as a result of earthquakes in Chile, in American Samoa, Christchurch, New Zealand, super typhoons in the Philippines, as well as in Taiwan. And finally, the Great Eastern Japan earthquake, magnitude 9.1 earthquake, changes the tilt of the Earth's axis, moves Japan 7 feet, drops the coastline by more than a meter, and has a wall of water that reaches 133 feet, that reaches 6.5 miles inland. Extraordinary. Ends up with the loss of power to primary, secondary, and tertiary power at Fukushima power plant. And the force that lands there has to figure out now what to do and how to react and respond to it. In addition to that, there's a number of events that play out in Northeast Asia, whether it's the leadership transitions that take place on the Korean Peninsula, the sinking of the Republic of Korea ship Chonan, leadership transition in Japan as well as in Taiwan, and transitions in China. Just a footnote about the event that took place here, the sinking of the Chonan, loss of 46 sailors in March of 2010. When the International Commission that reviewed the debris field picked up everything that it could and put it on land for everyone to walk around now, the ship now pieced back together. They could see the impact of the weapon had to the hull. They could see the residue marks. They found the impeller blades from the North Korean torpedo with North Korean markings on it. The defense minister said his biggest concern was that 35% of the population didn't believe it. No one wanted to deal with the hard, harsh reality that there would be some unprovoked, brutal act that would end up with loss of life. 6 months later, there was an artillery attack against the Northwest Islands where there were civilian lives lost as well as a couple of Marines who were there. 95% of the South Korean population wanted to remove leadership immediately from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as well as from the defense minister himself. That's how quickly events changed. I think it would be hazardous to take a view that is openly dismissive of how quickly events can change, where we misunderstand the impact of nationalism in that part of the world. Last night we talked about just a quick review of how many countries have developed in a very short period of time. From 51 countries in 1946 to 193 today. It's 196 if you count Tibet, Taiwan, and Vatican City. What does that statistic actually represent? To me, it's a representation of ethnicity and identity. What that means in Indonesia in August of 1945 is that after 350 years of Dutch rule, people figured out how to cobble together 17,000 rocks, islands, and formations. 3,500 dialects, came up with a language and came up with a political system that represented their national interest. To infringe on that or to step into that, whether it's in the search of resources or by other means, is to invite, I think, conflict and provocation. So in Southeast Asia, when we're looking at competing claims in the South China Sea, this is not about us going to war against China. This is about how we value our relationships with our allies and our partners in the region. And when we see them come under a lot of coercive pressure and language from China, how do we react to it? To come in from a position of weakness with a speech is not going to move anyone. But as to Mike's point, to be able to keep pace with technology that's developing in the region, it's proliferating whether we like it or not, I think is another statement entirely different. So from the service perspective, we take a pragmatic point of view. We're not really interested in the flag, maybe that other services would. From the Air Force and the Navy perspective, we deal with technology, and we either keep pace with it or we run from it. It's that simple, it's that black and white. So when China develops the DF-21 missile, that can range carriers. That's a maneuvering target thousands of miles away. That's technology that we simply respect and that we have to deal with. That doesn't mean we're planning an invasion of China. What that means is, if you want to play, if you want to continue to have influence with your partners in the region, you have to address it, whether you want to or not. In South Asia, we're witnessing a steady growing relationship with India. We're also witnessing the challenge of piracy attacks that now reach all the way out to the Maldives, as well as in Oceania, the fight for fish. We're seeing increased competition in the economic exclusion zones, and now we're seeing open poaching taking place that impacts the economies of local Pacific Island countries. So when we try and figure out, to the points raised here already, how we always get it wrong, what we have to be prepared for is strategic surprise. Now, how do you budget for that? How do you strategize that? Much different problem, much more complex, too murky, too ambiguous for people that have pencils that are trying to assign a number to whatever it is you're trying to achieve in the way of an outcome. So to have the capability and the capacity to respond to events that we just didn't plan for. Go back to the chart that you saw last night. As we move from general purpose forces to a force that's concentrated on counterinsurgency and look ahead. And the point is, it's not so much that we're on the brink of war, it's that we're on the brink of brittleness. Because we've had a continuous feeding frenzy here on U.S. forces, we are looking at the impact that it has on airplanes, on ships, on people over time. It is not sustainable. And so now you get the question about whether or not you want to continue a leadership position. So right up front in the strategy discussion, you have to understand whether or not you want to lead. Do you want to be number two? I mean, you help us understand what the American people want to see and do. If you want to continue to lead, it's an argument for the status quo. That is a very hard argument to make in Washington.